Okay, well, welcome everybody. I'm Dorothea Wolfson. I'm the program director of the MA in Government Center program. It's really wonderful to be here today. I'm especially, excited to welcome Kyle Kondik here to talk about his book. Now, we've invited many great authors to come to the center to discuss their work, but I'm especially pleased to introduce one of our own, Kyle Kondik, who received his MA in Government in 2019, and one of his classmates who also received is in the audience here, Alex Barris. His thesis received the William F. Klinger Award for the thesis that excels at assessing a topic in institutional or representative government using original research and displaying superior writing skills. Now, he so deserved that award. He is an outstanding model of what students can do with their thesis work. That is, use their research to publish an article, or if they are really ambitious, a book. And of course, Kyle did just that, and that's why we are here today to discuss his latest book, The Long Red Thread, How Democratic Dominance Gave Way to Republican Advantage in U.S. House Elections. This book is an outgrowth of his Hopkins thesis and presents a history of the growth of Republican power in the House of Representatives. He is also the author of The Bellwether, which is a history of Ohio's presidential voting record. Now, Kyle is managing editor of Sabato's Crystal Ball, the University of Virginia's Center for Politics authoritative, nonpartisan newsletter on American campaigns and elections. He is frequently cited expert on American politics, and he has appeared on CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, PBS NewsHour, and Comedy Central's The Daily Show. And just last Thursday, he had an op-ed in the New York Times in which he shared his thoughts and predictions about next year's midterm elections. So he's been very busy and very prolific, which is just wonderful. Before joining the Center for Politics in 2011, Kyle served as Director of Policy and Research for former Ohio Attorney General Richard Cordray, and as a reporter, editorial page editor, and political columnist at newspapers in Northeast Ohio. He currently lives in Northeast Washington, D.C. with his wife, Lottie Walker, and their young son, Albert. So welcome, Kyle. We're delighted to have you today.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thanks, everybody. And thanks for tuning in if you're watching. I just wanted to first just recognize that, this project was an outgrowth of my master's thesis at Johns Hopkins. And so I think it's cool that I'm able to come here and talk about it as an actual book published by Ohio University Press, which is my undergraduate alma mater. I also wanted to thank my buddy Alex Barris and his wife Jamie, who are here. I would have even done this program if Alex hadn't told me about it. 2017, we did the program together, and I'm really glad that I did, and it was a great experience. So with that, I want to talk about the House, the U.S. House of Representatives. This book, The Long Red Thread, it is a history of U.S. House elections since the 1960s. And sort of talk about how, back then, Democratic dominance in the House was sort of taken for granted. The 1960s was sort of the midpoint of a 6-decade period where Democrats controlled the House majority for 60 of 64 years. Until that reign was ended in the 1994 Republican Revolution. Since then, the Republicans have held the House majority for 20 of 28 years. But of course, the Democrats have the U.S. House majority today. And so I want to talk about some of the big picture trends in the House and sort of how the House transitioned from Democratic dominance to this period where I wouldn't necessarily say it's Republican dominance. Of course, the Democrats have the House majority today, but it's a time period where the House majority is, there are competitive battles for it every 2 years, but the Republicans tend to win a little bit more often than the Democrats, and quite possibly the Republicans are positioned to take the House majority back in 2022. So with that, let me go to my presentation here. So just basics on the House. The House, 435 members. The seats are apportioned every 10 years based on the results of the U.S. Census. The map on the left shows the results of the recent census, and it generally illustrates the trends that we're used to in the House, which is that the Southwest, or the South and the West, are gaining seats. The Northeast and the Midwest have sort of been losing seats. as the Sun Belt grows faster than the so-called Rust Belt or the so-called Frost Belt or whatever you want to call it, where I'm from, up in Cleveland. And so the states in red are the ones that lost seats. The states in yellow and blue are the ones that gained seats. The one exception this time is California. California had been growing and growing and growing and gaining House seats for many decades. But in this most recent census, for the first time ever, California actually lost a seat, although California still has the largest House delegation. It's just 52 now instead of 53. The map on the right shows the census or the House seat growth patterns since 1960, which is when I basically start the book. And as you can see, it really brings into relief that that overall trend, which is that the Northeast and the Midwest have been shedding seats. The South and the West have been gaining seats. The House has been fixed at 435 members ever since 1913, and so the average number of people in a House district in that decade, or in the 1910s, was 210,000 people. Going into the 2020s, it's going to be about 760,000 people. So the amount of people represented in each House district has really grown quite a lot over the course of the past century. There are sometimes talks to expand the size of the House, to increase the membership, maybe make the members a little more responsive to individual people in their districts, but there's no real practical reality that would happen. So the House grew in size for many decades prior to the 1910s, but it's been stuck at 435 since then. The only exception is that when Alaska and Hawaii entered the Union in the late 1950s, the House temporarily went up to 437 to give each of those states a single member, but went back to 435 in the 60s. Just as a point of trivia, 538 electoral votes. The reason we have that number is 435 House members plus the 100 senators for each, or two senators per state, and then plus the 3 electoral votes that the Washington D.C. gets, even though they don't have voting representation in the U.S. House and don't have U.S. senators. So that's how we get that 538 number, and that number has also been fixed since the 1960s. The way the districts are drawn, so of course you have the census every 10 years, and the principle now of drawing these districts is that it should be one person, one vote, meaning that at least within states, the district sizes should be essentially almost exactly equal. There are sometimes exceptions that can be made under the law. Sometimes in small states, if they want to keep counties together or that sort of thing, you can have a little bit more population deviation. But other than that, you basically have to have, the districts all have to have essentially equal population. It didn't always used to be that way, though. Prior to some landmark US Supreme Court decisions in the 1960s, it was pretty common for districts and states not to have equal population or to have drastically unequal population. So if you look, for instance, at the districts that existed in 1960, you look at states like Texas and Michigan, for instance, there were sometimes districts that had 4 times the number of people that another district would have. And you saw city areas underrepresented, but particularly growing suburban areas at that time were very much underrepresented. So in Michigan, for instance, the Upper Peninsula, which had had back then and has now very few people. The Upper Peninsula actually had 2 House members, and you had some places in the growing Detroit suburbs that were gigantic that only had a single House member. And this U.S. Supreme Court, as I think it now is done in partisan gerrymandering, I'll get into that in a second. The U.S. Supreme Court for a long time decided or thought that it should not get involved in these districting matters. And there's a famous quote from the famous Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter. He said, "We shouldn't get involved in the so-called political thicket of districting questions." But eventually, in the early 1960s, the idea of equal population sort of finally made its way into the Supreme Court, finally convinced the court. And so in a series of important decisions, Baker v. Carr in 1962, and then Westbury v. Sanders applied to Congress in 1964, created this equal population standard, this one person, one vote standard. And so that's why I start the book in 1964, because it's right after the districting decisions, and so our sort of modern scheme of drawing districts is essentially created in the early 60s, in which the districts have to have equal population. And so over the course of the 1960s and into the 1970s, you have every state that has more than one member having to redraw their districts to meet this equal population standard. It's kind of interesting, though, is that even though the districts were drastically redrawn in a lot of places, it didn't really have that much bearing on the overall majorities. In that, what you saw was there was, in terms of the changes that happened in like 1966 and 1968, it wasn't like you saw dramatically different changes in the states that drew new districts versus those that didn't draw new districts. And then you get to 1970, the 1970 census, and that sort of sets up the kind of regular redistricting scheme that we have now in the United States, which is that a census comes out at the start of the decade, and then by the time or for the election year the election year ending in 2, so 1970 would have been 1972, all of the states with more than one district have to redraw their districts to meet that equal population standard. And so that's been the sort of regular rhythm of redistricting ever since 1970. Now, so that's the way these districts are drawn. However, the Supreme Court, while it did weigh in on one person, one vote, it has never outlawed so-called partisan gerrymandering. That's drawing district lines to benefit one party or the other. There's the famous editorial cartoon that I've got on my slide here of what was called the I guess it would have been the gerrymander at that time, because it was named for the Massachusetts governor at the time, Elbridge Gerry. How it became a soft G as opposed to a hard G over the course of history, I don't know. But his party at the time was the Democratic Republicans, which is essentially the Jeffersonian, Madisonian party. And they had drawn some district lines to benefit themselves at the expense of the Federalists, which was the other major party at the time. And so this editorial cartoon was created by a Federalist editorial cartoonist who was upset about the way this one district looked. And he sort of put these wings on it and this dragon's head. And so it became what we now know as the gerrymander. It's kind of interesting about this district is that the Federalists actually won it pretty quickly after it was drawn. And so it sort of shows that the gerrymandering doesn't always work. But there are other famous examples of gerrymandering even before this. There's some belief, for instance, that when James Madison first won election to the US House, that his district was drawn to basically to try to prevent him from winning, but he won anyway, and he defeated James Monroe, who of course also was a future president. And there are even some examples of kind of nefarious district drawing that happened in sort of the pre-nationhood era during colonial times. If you look at like some of the colonial legislatures, et cetera. So basically gerrymandering is as old or older than the Republic itself. That doesn't necessarily make it good. Sometimes we say, oh, well, people have been doing this forever, so who cares? But it is just sort of a long-standing reality in American politics. So in the most recent kind of landmark Supreme Court decision dealing with partisan gerrymandering was Rucho v. Common Cause in 2019, where in a 5-4 decision, the conservatives on the US Supreme Court said, we're just not going to get involved in partisan gerrymandering. Now, the courts do often get involved, and federal courts often get involved in racial gerrymandering. So that can end up being either that a particular group, for instance, black voters in a given area, sometimes and this generally is something that Republicans might do because black voters are generally going to vote Democratic, or at least the vast majority are. You can either, as a Republican, pack as many black voters into a specific district as a way of making a really Democratic district, and all the other ones around it become much whiter and therefore much more Republican. Or you could also do something that's called cracking, which is to take that same group and split them up into a number of different districts in order to dilute their voting power. And those sorts of claims can be brought in federal courts. And so that is in some ways a way to deal with partisan gerrymandering, because if you're talking about racial gerrymandering, you sometimes are also indirectly talking about partisan gerrymandering. So those kinds of cases still happen. Also, some state Supreme Courts have gotten involved in trying to fight gerrymandering in their own states. The recent examples have been in Pennsylvania and North Carolina the past few years, and those have been situations where Democratic majority state courts have thrown out Republican congressional gerrymanders in most states. So that's also another wrinkle in this process. But bottom line is that while the Supreme Court eventually intervened on one person, one vote, they have not intervened on partisan gerrymandering. So that's sort of the environment that that we're in and how these districts are drawn. Gerrymanders can be quite effective. These are the results in Ohio, my home state, in the 2010s. And so this was a Republican drawn gerrymander that was designed to elect 12 Republicans and 4 Democrats to the US House. And as you can see, the map is exactly the same for all 5 elections. Now, there were a few close calls on this map, but it performed exactly the way that the people who drew the map wanted it to. And so this to me is sort of a textbook example of a partisan gerrymander. There are plenty of others you could pick, but it's pretty striking that you could go and you also think about the political environments in these various years. You've got Barack Obama winning Ohio in 2012, and then you've got big Republican wave years in Ohio in 14 and 16. You got a Democratic wave year in 2018, and yet the map is so ingeniously constructed to elect 12 Republicans and 4 Democrats that it just never changes throughout the course of the decade. So as I mentioned earlier, the course of the book, 1964 to 2020, the first part of that time period is very much a time of Democratic dominance. I mentioned that the Democrats controlled the House for roughly 60 of 64 years, starting basically after the 1930 midterm, which was in the midst of the Depression. The Republican majority got whittled down to very little in the House in 1930, and the House didn't open back then until the following December. So the House opened in December 1931. And in the course of some special elections held in the first part of 1931, the Democrats actually took control of the House then. So that's when the start of this sort of Democratic dominance in the House begins. And the Republicans only win majorities twice from that 1931, 1930 period all the way to 1994, 1946 and 1952. That's it. The Republicans don't win at all. And as you can see, not only did the Democrats have the majority, but the majorities were often huge. There were times when they got it to almost 300 seats in 1964, in the mid 70s. And before the Republicans won the House in 1994, they never even got to 200 seats in the initial part of this time period. So it really was a time of Democratic dominance. Although it's also important to remember that the Democratic majorities of the 60s, 70s, and 80s are a lot different than what the Democratic majority would be now, in that the Democrats were sort of this alliance between essentially Northern liberals and Southern conservatives. So you had a lot of you had a lot of ideological diversity within the Democratic caucus. And there are sometimes elections you can view historically as not changing the majority party in the House, but essentially empowering either Democratic liberals or Democratic conservatives. For instance, the 1958 election, which is right before the time frame in my book, that was a huge Democratic wave, and that sort of helped build up a big coalition of a lot of Northern liberals. Then you get to 64, which is another big Democratic wave year, and that builds Democratic majorities big enough that they're not just Democratic, but they're also pretty liberal. And that sort of allows the Lyndon Johnson Great Society programs to get passed in 65 and 66, because you have basically enough kind of Johnson allies in the House to be able to do those sorts of things. And then 1966 comes along, the Republicans pick up a lot of seats that year, Democrats still have the majority, but the alliance between the Southern Democratic conservatives and the conservative Republicans is enough to kind of take some of the wind out of the sails of the liberals in the Democratic caucus. But bottom line is you have Democratic speakers throughout this time period. You do have this kind of push and pull between liberals and conservatives, but again, there are Democratic majorities. And then you get to that 1994 inflection point, and then you see, the Republicans have majorities more often than Democrats do, but the Republican majorities typically are not nearly the size of the Democratic ones that you saw prior to 94. You do have in 2014, the Republicans spiked to 247 seats, which was their biggest majority since 1928, right before the Great Depression and right before this time period of Democratic dominance. So you have a kind of a closely divided House, but one where Republicans more often have the advantage than Democrats do. As I mentioned, if you just extend out to 2023, you consider the end of this current Congress, the Republicans will have held the House majority for 20 of 28 years in that time period. So the book argues that there's this sort of Republican advantage in U.S. House elections, particularly since 1994. And I essentially have kind of three kind of big umbrella reasons for why I feel that way. And it sort of also gets into some of the kind of bigger picture trends as to what's been going on in House elections over the past several decades. The first one is nationalization of elections. And so it used to be pretty common for House districts to vote for one party for president and the other party for their local House race. And so you can see that in the chart here, that in blue is Democratic House members in districts that Republicans won for president. And then the red line is Republican House members in districts that Democrats won for president. Now you can see those huge spikes for the Democrats in the 60s and 70s. Now, part of that was because the Democrats got clobbered in some of these presidential elections. And so you're naturally going to have a lot of, if the Republicans are winning big for president, you're naturally going to have a lot of Democrats who end up in seats that the Republican presidential candidate won. But even if you look at like 1976, for instance, which was a very close competitive national election. Jimmy Carter won by 2 points nationally over Gerald Ford. You could see there were still way more Democrats in Ford won seats than there were Republicans in Carter won seats. And so the Democrats had this advantage in part because the party was so ideologically diverse that you particularly had a lot of Southern conservatives who were Democrats in districts that were starting to vote Republican for president. And also, voters were just splitting their tickets much more often. So, in a year like 1976, you have a little less than a third of all the House seats voting for one party for House, one party for president. But then over time, you could see that the number of these crossover districts starts to decline. The parties become more ideologically cohesive. And also, you could argue that the parties also adopt kind of nationalizing strategies. I'd say the most famous example of that on the Republican side is the rise of Newt Gingrich as the leader of the Republican House Caucus. Gingrich was first elected in 1978. He lost in 74 and 76, running in the metro Atlanta area. He was running against a pretty conservative Democrat, pretty standard for the time. You'd have a bunch of Democrats from Georgia, but they were essentially white conservatives. So anyway, Gingrich gets elected to the House. He immediately becomes kind of a bomb thrower within the caucus. He's urging the Republican leadership, which sort of was more accommodating to the Democrats at the time, to sort of pursue more kind of aggressive strategies. And over the course of the 80s, when the Republicans had so much success at the federal level, Ronald Reagan won 2 terms as president, and then George H.W. Bush won in 1988. The Republicans were still stymied in their quest to win House majorities at this time. And what a lot of Republicans, particularly Gingrich, wanted to do was, hey, how do we get all these Southern conservatives that vote Republican for president to start voting Republican in their local House race? And eventually, they begin to become successful at that. Party identification amongst white Southerners changes throughout the 80s and early 90s. You finally start to see the Republican Party kind of become the majority party in terms of self-identification for Southerners in the early part of the 90s. And you start to see this sort of decline in people splitting tickets. And so you used to have that, incumbency used to be valuable, particularly for these members in these crossover districts, and voters were splitting tickets. You saw this in the Senate was a lot, the Senate was the same way, in that you had a lot of states that voted differently for their Senate race and also for president. But that just has been on the decline for the past several decades, to the point where you can see that there's very little crossover in 2020. And then the other piece of this puzzle is that it's particularly important for Republicans to have the House results look like the presidential results, because particularly in recent years, the median House seat by presidential performance has been right of the nation. So in 2012, for instance, if you sort all 435 districts as currently drawn from most Democratic, or rather where Barack Obama did the best to how Mitt Romney did the best, the median seat is about 4 points to the right of the nation as a whole. That was also true in 2016. It was a little less stark in 2020. The median House seat was about 2 points to the right of the nation. But the overall point is that if you have House races where there's a lot of correlation between the presidential and the House result, that's better for Republicans because the House map has a little bit of a Republican bias at this particular junction in history. Gary Jacobson, the great House scholar at University of California, San Diego, he found that the correlation between the House results and the presidential results in 2020 was the highest he had on record, which he goes back to 1952. So if you've got a situation where the House and the presidential results look very similar, that is a benefit for the Republicans, given the way that the map looks. There have also been realignment. So the changing patterns of voter behavior, people switching their loyalties from Democratic to Republican, sort of states and places in counties changing over time. And so I just wanted to show kind of the evolution of how the different regions have voted for House over the time period I'm talking about. So I picked 3 years to look at. They're all about a quarter century apart. First one's 1968. Second one is 94, when the Republicans flipped the House. And then the last one is 2020, the most recent election, where the Democrats held a very small majority in the House. So what you can see here, the basic regional pattern here is that this is 1968. This was the crazy 1968 presidential election where you had 3 major candidates: Hubert Humphrey, the Democrat; Richard Nixon, the Republican, who won. And then you also had George Wallace, who was a Democrat but was a very conservative Democrat who ran as a third-party candidate. And he did quite well in South in particular. But even in that time, the Democrats are still winning about 75% of the seats in that greater South region, which is the 11 states of the old Confederacy. I also have West Virginia, Kentucky, and Oklahoma in that group. And even at that time, the greater South had the highest percentage of the seats of at least 5 regions I've identified, 29% of the seats. You've got the Democrats have kind of modest edges on the West Coast and the Northeast. The Midwest, which is historically kind of the most competitive presidential region in the US, it has often had more of a Republican lean in US House elections. It did in 1968, although it was competitive. Republicans had 59% of the seats. And then the interior West, which doesn't really have that many House seats, 7% of the total at this time, but it was very much blood red at this particular point. So the Democrats, you could sort of see the Democratic coalition being the conservative South, and then the more kind of liberal progressive Northeast and West Coast. So let's go to 94. One of the interesting things about 94 is that this is the Republicans win the majority. They get 230 seats, first majority in 40 years. But that a lot of those regional patterns kind of go away, and it's sort of more balanced across the country. Republicans still dominate in that interior West region, but the West Coast is an exact tie. The Democrats have a small edge in the Northeast. Republicans have a small edge in the Midwest. And for the first time in modern history, the Republicans actually won a slight majority of the House seats in the greater South, which at this point is up to 32% of all the House seats, up from 29 in 68. You can see the Northeast and the Midwest, they were at about 26, 27% of all the seats. They're down to 22 apiece. The interior West and the West Coast have a little bit bigger share. So let's look at 2020 now. This is where you see kind of the more modern pattern that we're familiar with. And you sort of see this in presidential elections too. The South has become blood red. The Republicans have 68% of all the seats in the South. It's actually a little bit higher. The Democrats made up a little ground in 2018 and 2020. It was more like 75% as recently as 2016. And also the greater South is up to 35% of all the seats. So it's the biggest, most important region, and it has shifted very heavily toward the Republicans over the course of this time frame that I'm talking about. You have this Democratic alliance with the West Coast and the Northeast, and those areas are both very strongly Democratic now. Democrats have almost 80% of the seats in the West Coast, and they have almost 80% of the seats in the Northeast. And that's true in presidential elections too. The Democrats won all of those states in those 2 regions for president. Meanwhile, in the South, Joe Biden won only Georgia and Virginia. You continue to have a Republican edge in the Midwest. It's pretty similar to what they had in the previous 2 slides I showed. The interior West is a little bit less Republican, but still Republican overall. The Democrats have made inroads in states like Nevada, Colorado, and Arizona, but broadly speaking, that's still a Republican region. So at this point, you have the overall kind of House regions looking a lot like the Electoral College. But one of the advantages for the Republicans is that in the region that's the biggest and has the most seats, the South, they have built this gigantic advantage. And that's part of the reason why they were able to maintain House majorities throughout the 90s and the 2000s is that, when they finally took a majority of the Southern House seats in 1994, there was still a lot of meat on the bone there. And they've kind of gradually added to that over time. And they may be able to do even more of that moving forward here into 2022. But the bottom line is there's been these changes in these kind of regional House voting patterns and the Democratic growth in the Northeast and the West Coast. They do have the majority now, so it's helped keep them a little bit ahead. But the Republicans have just overwhelming strength in the South and continue to be very competitive in the Midwest and the Interior West. Third reason for the Republican advantage, and this kind of helps explain what's happened to the South to some degree, is that the Democrats used to dominate the redistricting process, particularly in the 70s and 80s, and now the Republicans do. So this map is the party control of redistricting by state for this redistricting cycle, which is underway right now. You can see there's a lot more red on that map than blue. The Republicans controlled the line drawing at 187 seats. Democrats only 75, and then the others are a mix of commission states and also states with a divided control of government. But if you go back to, if you look at some of the kind of famous partisan gerrymanders in the more distant past, for instance, the Democrats had this pretty nefarious gerrymander of California in the 1980s, named for Phil Burton, who was a big-time power broker in the House, and actually he holds the seat that Nancy Pelosi holds now in San Francisco. But he drew this map that was derisively called the Burton-mander. It gave the Democrats this huge added edge in California. Democrats were known for particularly vicious redistricting and gerrymandering in Texas, which helped allow the Democrats hold on to their House majorities there, even as Texas statewide became Republican. But over time, the Democratic dominance of the redistricting process kind of eroded. They lost, particularly in the South, their control of congressional delegations, the governorships, and then finally the state legislatures throughout much of the South. And also, one other important part of the redistricting story is that even though Republicans had very little direct control over redistricting in the early 90s, the Justice Department, then under President George H.W. Bush, they started to push for the creation of more majority-minority districts throughout the country, and that was particularly important in the South, where you had a lot of Black voters. Although the push for the push for majority-minority districts were also affected, or also helped create a lot of Hispanic majority districts. But what happened was that the Democrats had and the courts had sort of looked at the Voting Rights Act in the 1980s and sort of had come up, this interpretation emerged that, and there were legal changes too, that it sort of, you could read it as promoting the drawing of more of these majority-minority seats. And what Republicans in the Justice Department, or the Bush-led Justice Department, looked at it and said, wait a second, if we start pushing for more of these majority-minority seats, what you end up doing is creating a lot of safe Democratic seats and helping make the other districts around them whiter and thus more Republican, because at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, party identification amongst whites in the South was beginning to become majority Republican also in the early 90s. So you have this interesting mix. And so even though Democrats, nominally, had technical control of the redistricting process in the South, this intervention by the Justice Department, I think, helped sort of speed along the elimination of a lot of the kind of white conservative Democrats in the South and help them be replaced by Republicans. Now, there also was, there were lawsuits that kind of pushed back on the Justice Department in some of these cases. Some of the districts that were created were changed in such a way that they didn't essentially pack as many minority voters into the same district. And a lot of the jurisprudence over racial redistricting that now guides some of these things now was sort of created at that time period. But bottom line is that the Democratic dominance in the redistricting process erodes in the 1990s, in part because of because of what the Justice Department decided to do. And then as you get into 2000, into 2010 and 2020, what you see are more and more states where Republicans control redistricting and fewer where Democrats control redistricting. The Republicans actually had a bigger overall edge in the 2010 redistricting cycle than they do now, but they do control the drawing of many more districts than the Democrats do, and that does have an impact on who wins and who loses majority. So you may have seen in news coverage, the Democrats only have a 222 to 213 edge in the House, so the Republicans only need 5 seats to win the House next year. And there's been some thought that just the disproportionate Republican control of redistricting could allow Republicans to take the House next year, even if the political environment is otherwise kind of neutral or even Democratic leaning. Speaking of, let's look specifically at 2020, look ahead to 2022, and then I'm happy to take some questions. So I mentioned that the number of these kind of crossover districts that elect one party for president, the other party for US House, they've been declining over time. So there are only 16 districts out of the 435 in 2020 that were, voted. It was a Democrat in a Trump district or a Republican in a Biden district. There are 9 Biden district Republicans. There are 7 Trump district Democrats. That's the lowest number of crossover districts since at least 100 years. The records going back into the early part of the 20th century are sort of spotty, but there's just not as much crossover as there used to be. And then you also get into another important dynamic, which is the midterm. The midterm is often the engine of change in the US House. So the House has changed majority party control 11 times since 1900. 9 of the times it changed were in a midterm election environment. The only 2 exceptions were the Democrats flipped the House in 1948 and when Harry Truman won re-election. Then 4 years later, when Dwight Eisenhower won his first term, Republicans won a narrow House majority in that election. But holding the White House is sometimes is sometimes what leads to a party losing a House majority. We've seen that many times in recent years, including the last 3 times that the last 4 times that the House flipped. 94, when the Republicans first won the House, that was Bill Clinton's first midterm. He had all sorts of problems, his own kind of healthcare fiasco, economic issues, et cetera. 2006, Democrats win the House back for the first time since they lost it in 94. That was George W. Bush was very unpopular, Iraq War, some of those other factors. 2010, Republicans win the House back under Barack Obama. You've got the Affordable Care Act, the healthcare fiasco. You've got the economy not recovering quite as much as it could have after the 2008 crash. And then most recently in 2018, Donald Trump's first midterm, the Democrats win the House back, and the Republicans have problems with healthcare again, other sorts of governance issues. So, so one of the things you just look at in 2022 is just based on the size that Democrats have this tiny House majority, Republicans have this redistricting advantage, and also it's just a midterm under a Democratic president. Those are sort of the brew in which you could see the House flipping, and it doesn't help that Joe Biden is now, his approval rating is low, etc. That sort of thing. The president's approval rating also, weighs or can weigh on these elections. Overall, the president's party has lost ground in the House in 37 of the 40 midterms since the Civil War. Average seat loss in that time period is 33 seats. Since World War II, it is smaller. It's 27 seats, but it's still pretty substantial. And one of the reasons why Republicans maybe didn't win the House prior to 94 is that they kept winning the presidency. And so from 1968 through 1992, they lost the presidency only once. And in fact, some of the political science literature from Gary Jacobson and Thomas Mann and some other major House scholars, they basically say, hey, if the Republicans ever want to win the House back, they got to lose the presidency. Well, they lost it in 92, and then they finally won the House back in 1994. And so one of the things that we see now, since the 90s, is that the Democrats have gotten a little bit better at winning presidential elections again, but there's a cost that's sometimes associated with that. It sounds like an oversimplification, but that winning the House or winning the White House can be a way to lose future majorities in both the House and the Senate. The chart here, I just think is always worth noting, which is that the turnout in the midterm is always lower than the presidential year. Presidential years in green, going back to the 70s. The midterm years are in orange. But note that 2018 was the highest modern midterm turnout, and 2020 was the highest modern presidential year turnout. So we might be entering kind of a more higher turnout period. We even saw that in some of the elections a couple of weeks ago that Republicans did quite well in Virginia and New Jersey, and the Virginia turnout was sort of off the charts, but it was ended up being kind of a favorable turnout for Republicans. And again, that's what you sometimes see in these midterm environments, is that president's party is just, or I'm sorry, the non-presidential party is more motivated to show up. And swing voters also, decide, hey, I voted for this guy in the presidential election, but now I want to take away some of his power. So we'll do that in the midterm environment. So, I think what you could sort of take away from the whole project is that again, we're in a competitive period for majorities in the U.S. House, but it's a time where the Republicans, I think, have more advantages than the Democrats do. I think 2022 is a great test of that. I think all the indicators are that the Republicans should take control. If for some reason they don't, if there's some sort of strange circumstance that impacts that, then I think maybe we need to revisit this a little bit. There was a kind of a somewhat similar circumstance 20 years ago. The Republicans had a very tiny House majority that they won in 2000 when George W. Bush narrowly won the presidency. In fact, they had, if you count an independent as who was essentially caucusing with Republicans as a Republican, the Republican House majority was exactly the same as the Democratic one now, 222 to 213. However, you have events intervening. You have 9/11, the lead up to the Iraq War. George W. Bush is very popular in that midterm. The Republicans also were starting to assert themselves in the redistricting process. And so they ended up netting a small number of seats in 2002, despite the fact that maybe at the start of that cycle, you would have thought, oh, they'll probably lose because they just won the White House. So, there are things that intervene to change these patterns. But again, the Democrats are going to need some help. So they need something, I think, kind of extraordinary to happen to help them hold on next year. And then, the next time the Democrats could win the House back, maybe it's a midterm of the next Republican president, whoever that ends up being, as we look ahead to 2024, 2028, et cetera. So with that, again, the book is The Long Red Thread: How Democratic Dominance Gave Way to Republican Advantage in U.S. House Elections. And it is an extended version of my Johns Hopkins master's thesis. So anyway, I appreciate you listening. I'm happy to take any questions that folks might have.
That was so great. I have a question to start off. I'm sure there are a bunch other people have here and also online, but so it seems like the South is key here, obviously. Right?
Yeah,
It's sort of
absolutely.
like, it's the economy stupid, it's the South stupid, right? For the Democratic Party to sort of regain, their ascendancy in the House. But how can they do it? Because in a way, it seems like we've talked about how the Democratic Party has become more ideologically, pure. And to me, it seems like the South, they have a lot of poor states in the South. They probably like the Democrats' economic, of plans, but it's the cultural aspect, right? I mean, is there a way, we had Al Fromm talk about sort of, kind of finding that middle road in the Democratic Party again? I mean,
I think a lot of the cultural stuff can be poison for Democrats, and we saw it in, I find this stuff really hard to look at in sort of a fair-minded way, because it gets kind of it becomes kind of a talking points thing. But in the Virginia governor's race, we had a lot of education talk, and basically there's sort of a fine point about so-called like critical race theory, which is the sort of buzz term that's out there. And I think you could narrowly say, well, wait a second, K through 12 kids in Loudoun County aren't getting taught about, quote, critical race theory. But then what I think a lot of cultural conservatives would say, and I think they have something of a point here, is that, there are certain kind of like, I don't know, sort of pretty academically like liberal sort of concepts that, for diversity and equity and whatnot that end up sort of bleeding into the instruction, and parents notice it and they don't like it or what have you. But also what we've seen is that there are some other sort of culturally conservative constituencies and places where Democrats have been losing ground. Like South Texas is a great example, where where Donald Trump did way better than Hillary Clinton even, than he did in 2016. And you just wonder if sort of cultural liberalism, I guess, is sort of something of an issue. And you have a lot of Democrats, like you mentioned, like Al Fromm, like Rui Teixeira is another one that really smart thinker on the Democratic side, who thinks that, hey, the Democratic Party needs to think about kind of meat and potatoes issues and think about politics the way that FDR did, sort of as a programmatic sort of thing. Now, the thing is, though, is that there are a lot of cultural liberals in this country too. And if the Democratic Party kind of leaves them behind, then where do they go? So that it's this sort of push and pull on the Democratic side. But I definitely think that there was a long time where, because of labor or because of economic policy or because of tradition or what have you, that there were a lot of people who were culturally conservative or moderate who voted Democratic. And you could look at like South Texas or that. I think a better example is probably a lot of kind of white working class enclaves in the north, like a lot of places in Northeast Ohio, a lot of places like the Iron Range in Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, et cetera. And the Democrats have just gotten totally hollowed out in those places. And, it's not like it's not like Republican administrations have come in and sort of saved those places necessarily. It's just that in this push and pull between the two parties, a lot of those voters have decided, I prefer the Republicans for X, Y, and Z. And so it's a tricky thing, but the Republicans have problems too. They've been hemorrhaging support in suburbs and exurban places. And it's just, the way I sometimes think about this is like, we could talk for a long time about the problems in both parties. What I think that tells us is that we're in a really competitive time where both parties are changing their coalitions and yet still retaining a lot of overall strength. There have been times in American history where I think like one party was clearly stronger than the other. Like before the Great Depression, the Republicans were definitely the stronger party. They won more often. They won congressional majorities more often. They won presidential elections more often. The New Deal Democratic era, you see the Democrats win 5 straight presidential elections. They have this hammerlock on the House and the Senate. And now we're at a time where there aren't huge advantages. I think there's some structural advantages the Republicans have, particularly in the Senate and the House. Some would say the Electoral College too, that maybe give them a little bit of an edge in a 50-50 style environment, but both parties are capable of winning when conditions allow.
I guess another thing I was thinking about too, with this is sort of the unintended consequences of good intentions. Like, you talked about the majority minority districts and how, in a way, that that's been a good thing. I guess the Justice Department mandated some of those, right?
Right.
But on the other hand, it did create these other safe pockets, right, of the white voting districts. And I just wanted to, I have a lot of respect for Francis Frankfurter, Felix Frankfurter, sorry. And he talked about the political thinking. Did he predict some of these things if if we cross that line? Well,
I think he really wanted the courts to just sort of stay out of this stuff, because he thought that, and I think like John Roberts probably feels the same way, that we don't want to make the Supreme Court the arbiter of like what the district line should look like in Ohio or what have you. That's fundamentally a choice for the Ohio legislature, or there are some states that are proactively trying to create commissions. Although the problem with this stuff is that even if you have a fair process, and like all of us in this room could come up with our own fair process and it might all be different. If you're a Democrat or Republican, it's going to be pretty rare to find a map that pleases both sides. And also you mentioned minority representation, and also, satisfies, typically once sort of a majority minority district is created, it generally has to be preserved, at least in a form in which that specific minority group, if it's cohesive, can elect the candidate of their choice. So there are all sorts of different preferences that you might have, and like I might say, well, let's create a bunch of safe seats so that this state's, let's say it's a state that the Democrats win by 10 for president, or let's say that the Democrats win 60 to 40 for president, has 5 House seats. Okay, I want the House map to reflect how it votes for president. So let's make 3 safe Democratic seats and 2 safe Republican seats. Okay, so that's the, but then someone else might say, well, let's try to make more competitive seats, and let's try to have 3 competitive seats and a safe seat for each side, or what have you. And then someone else might say, well, we actually need to, maybe we should draw a district in which this particular minority group has sway, or we don't cut as, we don't split as many county lines as maybe this other map would. Again, I can go on and on and on. The point is that none of those options are necessarily objectively the correct decision or objectively the incorrect decision. They're just decisions, and they're just preferences. And it's again, this is why it's so difficult, because even if I think personally, I think it'd be good if you had a situation where it wasn't just, well, the Republicans control Texas, so therefore they call the shots, or the Democrats control Illinois, and therefore they call the shots. That seems a little unfair, but what you actually replace it with, I think, is very much open to debate.
Well, what about independent commissions? Does that make a difference to
you? So sometimes there, an independent commission will, end up, sometimes they fail. Like Virginia just created an independent commission, and the commission couldn't function because of the design of the commission. Then in some states, like California has a commission that was in place for 2010, but there was some feeling that because California is such a Democratic state, that it eventually, that basically the Democrats and the people, the non-party affiliated members of the commission ended up creating a map that was basically good for Democrats. Then you have a state like New Jersey that has kind of a hybrid commission system. And New Jersey is a Democratic state at the presidential level. At the start of the decade, though, the Democrats thought they got screwed basically because the map was 6-6 in a Democratic state. But by 2020, it was 10-2 Democratic because things had changed within the state. So a map that looked really bad for them at the start of the decade wasn't so, was pretty good for Democrats. So, it's hard to do. I guess it's inherently fairer, but the way you create these commissions can lead to success or failure. In Virginia, it looks like it's a failure.
All right, we have a few questions from online. Amy Johnson asks, do you see any chance of DC getting a House seat?
It's interesting. DC came close to getting one in the 2000s because Utah felt like they got cheated out of their 4th House seat in the 2000s. It was basically that the census didn't properly count Mormon missionaries, I think was the thing. And so another state got the 435th seat instead of Utah. And Utah was so angry about it that they kept, they tried to get the census to redo the numbers. But there was actually a deal that was hatched in which Utah would get its 4th seat and DC would get a seat, and the House would expand to 437. But it just never happened. It kind of came close to happening, but it sort of fell apart at the end of the last decade. The Democrats, essentially because we know that Washington, D.C. would elect the Democrats at the House, as it does now, a Democratic delegate to the House. There's been a lot of talk of DC, DC statehood, but if it would take the Democrats essentially pushing it through and getting rid of the filibuster to do that. Maybe they will at some point. It seems like whatever energy to do that in this Congress has stalled. And if you believe that the Democrats are in for a rough election next year, as I think I do at this point, but we'll see. The Republicans would have the House and or the Senate, and then the DC statehood concept would go away, at least until the next time the Democrats have majorities and are willing to essentially break the filibuster to do it, or if they'd have 60 Senate seats, which doesn't seem like a real possibility for them in the short term.
Okay. Michael Parmeri asks, as a matter of apportionment theory, how significant is the ratio factor to your thesis? In other words, does a 435 member House, which represents hundreds of thousands of residents per elector, favor Republicans? If so, what quantitatively do you think it is about larger apportionment ratios that favors the Republican Party?
That's interesting. I didn't really look at that. I will say though that in some of the northern states, in particular like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Ohio, there's a great book by a guy named Jonathan Rodden who has talked about sort of some of the population imbalance. I don't really get into that in the program, but I get into it in the book a little bit, that essentially, particularly in the North, there are kind of population disparities that kind of benefit Republicans in part because the Democratic vote is so concentrated in big city areas or even small cities that are surrounded by Republicans. But the reason I bring that up is that so the whatever population imbalance problems that the Democrats have at the congressional level, they're sometimes worse, particularly at the state Senate level in a state like Ohio and a state like Pennsylvania. And there are like Ohio has 33 state senators and only has 16 House seats right now. So let's say hypothetically you doubled the size of the House. You go from 435 to 870. So a state like Ohio would have 32, 33 House members instead of what they have now. Well, those districts would look a lot like the state Senate districts, and the state Senate districts are even worse for Democrats than the congressional districts are. So I think that there's this sort of belief, I think, among some that Democrats would benefit if the size of the House was expanded, and that might be true in certain places. But I think in maybe some of the northern states, it maybe wouldn't be what they would hope because of some of those population balance problems. And again, now the maps in Ohio have been drawn by Republicans. If you did have a quote fair process, and the Ohio Supreme Court may end up drawing districts, at least for Congress this time, maybe you'd have a different outcome. But yeah, but anyway.
Okay. Kirk Otto asks, hey Kyle, longtime fan, first time questioner. As the states pick up the pace on redistricting, what are some trends you're seeing in the new congressional, and what are you looking forward to?
Kirk is the House reporter at National Journal and is a great guy and does excellent work. In terms of the redistricting so far, I think one of the things we've seen is that, like Texas is a great example of this, that hypothetically, Texas Republicans could have drawn a map that got them more seats in 2022 than this current map, the new map is going to get them. They have the Texas House delegation is 23-13 Republican right now. Ideally for Republicans, they added, Texas is growing, of course, so they got an extra 2 seats, they're up to 38 now. The map is drawn in such a way that the Republicans are hoping to get 25-13, so just adding those extra 2 seats effectively, or maybe getting 26-12 if those Republican trends in South Texas continue. But what they did as part of that was they took a couple of suburban seats that the Democrats had won in 2018, and instead of making them endangering those members, they essentially packed more Democrats into those districts. And that was a way of protecting the surrounding Republican incumbents, many of whom had been in more vulnerable seats, later in the 2010s. So that was an interesting situation where you have a party that is sort of thinking more about how do we lock this in for the rest of the decade as opposed to how do we maximize in 2022. Now, like Ohio just put out the Republicans put out a new map, and it's essentially designed to be a 13-2 Republican map, but there are enough competitive districts the Democrats can maybe win some, into the future here. So it's this push and pull between like making sure essentially no seats change hands throughout the decade and those drawing the districts get what they want versus, how do you sort of maximize now and then hope it sticks later on.
Adam Abramson asks, which is more detrimental to the body politic? The Twitter mob's brand of woke liberalism, as evidenced by cancel culture, or the far right's loss of touch with reality, as evidenced by conspiratorial thinking and the rise of QAnon?
I say it probably is. It's more damaging when you're the party in power. I think what happens is that the public becomes much more kind of aware of the excesses of the party in power. So there's this sort of a fancy term for this in political science. It's called thermostatic public opinion. Now, it's not necessarily about the stuff the questioner asked about. It's about like, for instance, if you ask questions about like immigration, for instance, I think you would see that in the Trump years, maybe Trump was seen as essentially too aggressive on the border. And now I think we're seeing that Biden is seen as essentially too soft on the border. And there's this longstanding trend There's a great book called Tides of Consent by the political scientist James Stimson, who sort of tracks how basically the public gets more conservative under a Democratic president, and then it gets more liberal under a Republican president. It's a long-standing trend. He tracks it back to, I think it goes back to the Eisenhower administration. And I bring that up just because I think that, the Democrats really want to focus on Trump and January 6th extremism. And look, like, I'm not making any sort of objective judgment, on whether people should or shouldn't focus on these things. I personally thought the January 6th thing was horrible and that there has to be consequences for it. It's something that Americans really should internalize and remember. However, I can't sit here and tell you that they will do that and that the public will continue to focus on that versus now that we have Joe Biden as president, worrying about the deficiencies of his administration, the various problems going on in the country, and the overreach from the left on certain cultural issues and whatnot. So I think that there's probably, if you have thermostatic public opinion on issues, you probably also have it on how, which party is portrayed as extreme or not.
Couple questions here.
Yeah, I guess so. This kind of builds on your comment a moment ago, and it's I earlier talked about how there was this alliance in previous decades, 50s, 60s, 70s, between conservatives and the Democratic Party and progressives. And so I'm interested in what I guess your take would be on the evolution of the Republican coalition over time, especially going forward now, because I agree with you that I think that the Republicans are very likely to win the majority in 2022. But the nature of the Republican coalition is very interesting because there are going to be 40, 50 really anti-government folks, the Freedom Caucus that's merged into this, MAGA Trump caucus and whatever else. And so I'm wondering what you think might be the prospects for really governance in a situation where you may actually have to have some coalition between some practical Democrats and some practical Republicans just to do basic things like pass budgets and keep the government running. So I'm just curious, as you think about the policy consequences of this realignment, maybe you could speculate a bit about what that might look for in the next 2, 6, however many years might go out.
It's a great question, a really important thing to think about. The one thing I thought was striking is, so you had this, bipartisan infrastructure bill that finally passed through the House recently, and you had 13 Republicans vote for it, and there was a much larger percentage of the Senate Republican caucus. I think 19 Republicans voted for it when it passed several months ago. And you had some of the Republicans in the House saying that we should basically strip committee assignments from some of the handful of relative moderates in the House Republican Conference because they voted for this bill. So in fact, there was a meeting this morning in which John Katko, who's one of the handful of Republicans in Biden won seats, defending himself on that vote, and also usually. Usually, and leadership doesn't seem like they want to, aggressively do that, attack these members this way. But often, leadership will really want to protect these kinds of members because they're kind of the majority makers. And what you may see, some more candidates like John Katko, for instance, winning. Now, I do think a lot of the Republican challengers, at least as I've been tracking the House so far, they're not necessarily Freedom Caucus types, but they're not like a John Katko or Brian Fitzpatrick, who are, I would say, like, legitimately, more like a centrist kind of moderate type. But there are also fewer of those folks on the Democratic side too. I mean, you've got some blue dogs left. You've got some of these swing district members, but when let's say the Republicans win 30 seats next year or something, I'm just pulling out a number. Who's going to lose? It's going to be all the moderates. It's going to be like Abigail Spanberger in Virginia. And it's going to be maybe Josh Gottheimer in New Jersey, who the left hates, but who's kind of more of a centrist member. So you probably will have a Republican caucus that is pretty ideologically conservative, not necessarily all Freedom Caucus types. And then the remaining Democrats will probably be mostly pretty left wing. You also have seen like Jackie Spear said she's retiring this morning from California. Who I don't think is like a moderate or anything, but she may very well be replaced by someone more liberal than she is. You've seen some of the Democratic leadership they're all aging. Pelosi may be gone as of 2023. Steny Hoyer might not be around for much longer. There's a changing of the guard on the Democratic side too. And, it used to be that there was this big ideological overlap within both the House caucuses, because you did have, there was a guy named Bill Green who represented the Upper East Side of Manhattan, the so-called Silk Stocking District. It was like the richest district in the country at that time. And he was a liberal Republican who won in the 70s and 80s when, Democratic presidential candidates won by 25 points or whatever in his district. There were others in the Northeast who were like that. They're all gone now. I sometimes will talk about, like, people say, well, who are the quote moderate members? And, like, honestly, it's not really moderate. It's maybe less progressive or less liberal or less conservative. There used to be, if you look at the I'm blanking on the statistic, basically the how liberal or how conservative a person's voting record is. Used to be there were a lot of Republicans who were to the left of some Democrats, and now there aren't. The most conservative Democrat is still to the left of the most liberal or centrist Republican. So I kind of wish that there was still that sort of like deal-making kind of group within the House, but it feels like that's kind of gotten hollowed out too, unfortunately. And to the extent that there are deal makers on both sides, they're the ones who end up getting swept up in waves. We saw that in 2018 too. Like, I think about someone like Eric Paulson in the Twin Cities. He was, again, he wasn't necessarily moderate, but he wasn't as conservative as probably the median member of the caucus. He got crushed, and that district's going to be like the Democrats from now on. There's this book I cite in my book called The Polarizers, which is about this concept of there was actually a big sort of argument in political science in the 50s and 60s. It's like, we need to have the parties be more ideologically distinct. This is a goal, because the public needs clear choices between the two parties. It's like, man, be careful what you wish for, because we got it now. And I don't know if it works. I don't know if it works any better. Now, again, part of the reason that, part of the ideological diversity of Congress back in the 50s and 60s is essentially because you had a lot of conservative segregationist Democrats. And so it's good I think it's good that the segregationist wing is gone, and that I think we've made a lot of progress on, racial issues and whatnot. But, the ideological cohesion of the two parties is just, it makes it hard to function in this system, because there's so many, it's not like a parliamentary system where you just have majorities that do what they want. This system is, there's all these choke points, which probably ends up frustrating the public too, with a lack of action. And even when you do have majorities, like the Democrats do now, they're so small that it's hard to do things, particularly in the Senate.
We have one more question, Alex.
Kyle, a little bit outside the scope of your book, I think, but what have you picked up on, what through political writings or the public in general through polling and things, what's changed, or has there been changes in thoughts of what a House member should be or do? I think about the idea of like a constituent services House member, someone that really builds up the votes by being almost a larger version of a war dealer type constituent services person versus more of a nationalized ideological figure. Do you see changes in what people think, what the voters or what political theorists think a House member should be and do over the last 100 years?
That's a great question. It's not something I really get into much in the book, although just from being familiar with the House literature, a lot of the literature in the 70s in particular is sort of about just that, which is because at that time there was a lot of focus on, why are all these incumbents so safe? Why do they keep getting reelected, even in districts that might be not that hospitable to them? And there was some belief that there was a focus on seniority and getting committee chairmanships. This is particularly true of, because part of the way that the conservative Southerners sort of dominated the House, even with big Democratic majorities, was through this powerful kind of committee chairmanship system. And so you have all these very senior Democratic conservatives who held these committee chairmanships, and that was sort of seen as something that voters themselves valued. Over time, I think, and Tom Davis, who's the former Virginia House member. He was the chairman of the National Republican Congressional Committee for a long time. Person who's of former House members is probably quoted in the press maybe more than anyone else, is someone who I think is pretty universally respected, someone I respect. He talks about how from when he started to now, that the voting patterns are much more what he calls parliamentary, that you're essentially voting for the party as opposed to the person. And so whether the public, I don't know what the polls necessarily say, if you'd ask people, when you're considering who you vote for, do you consider the party more, or do you consider the person more? I don't necessarily know if that question's been asked or if there's a trend line on that, but the voting behavior itself tells you that they're thinking more about the party than the person, given that incumbency is valuable. The correlation between House and presidential results is so high right now. But what you're talking about, Alex, was something that I think was much more of a part of the sort of way we thought about, or the way that political scientists talked about House elections in the 70s and 80s, and how even the sort of the media and how candidates themselves thought about it was like, bringing home the bacon, making sure, being responsive to constituents and those sorts of things. And that sort of stuff is important too, I think, or at least I think House members probably believe it's important. The other thing that I think is interesting is that you have had a number of House leaders lose primaries, which you wouldn't necessarily think of in the past. Like Eric Cantor is the best example. He would have been speaker, and yet Dave Bratt kind of attacked him for being essentially distant from his district, which is Greater Richmond area, Central Virginia, in that Cantor's position as a national leader actually hurt him. I think Mitch McConnell has been hurt to some degree by being the Senate minority or majority leader. It's just that Kentucky is so Republican that he's been able to win his general elections. But there's maybe not, if you think that sort of seniority was rewarded, if you think about like a Sam Rayburn or something, or one of the sort of giants of the House leadership, and now it's almost like you wonder if it's almost if it's bad electorally to be in leadership, like Joe Crowley, who lost to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. He was the number 4 House Democrat. Was that actually? I mean, it couldn't have helped him that much because he wouldn't have lost otherwise. It was very helpful, that high level position. So you may have gone from a time where people sort of valued incumbency and seniority to a point where maybe now it might not only not be valued, but it might actually be a problem.
All right, well, thank you so much. This was a great talk and wonderful discussion afterwards. Thank you for coming.